Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the War Report. I am pleased to announce I am not alone tonight. GSP indeed has returned. I'm
Oh,
not
hello.
lying. I'm not making this up. He is back, and I'll give the floor to him. Just because it's been, I don't know, probably like 5 weeks since the last episode
Yeah.
he was on, and I'm sure he has a couple things he would just like to say in general before we get into the meat of the show.
Yeah, so I'm sorry that I've been away from the show. But there has been a lot that has been going on, particularly with my mother's health. And she needs a lot of help. My mom has been diagnosed with cancer. And everyone in my family has been back and forth, including my mom, from the hospital and home. And we're doing our best and praying that she makes a full recovery, that she will be strong enough for an operation that will extend her life. And it has been impossible. Just as in March and April, I could not, for the same reasons, do the show. So that is why I have been away. And I ask you to please pray for her. Thank you.
Well, certainly good to have you back, and I know that behind the scenes I've known a little bit longer than the audience has, and once again, as I'm sure I've told you many times, my deepest sympathies, and of course, I do pray for her health at every opportunity I get. And
Thank you.
um, once again, we all understand that takes priority. If you need to dip again for any undisclosed
Yeah,
amount of time, I think everyone understands here. And uh, but but we are glad to have you back in that regard. And like I said, you can uh, tell us as much as you want to in terms of updates with that. And like I said, just feel free to keep us posted as much as you
sure.
want. But without further ado, if you'd like to continue,
Yeah.
because it's been so long, I think you're eager to get back into it. So I'll shut my mouth and I'll let you continue.
Thank you. Thank you, Constantine. Okay, so I guess the big news on the war front in the Russo-Ukrainian war has been the incursion by the Ukrainians in the Kursk region. I guess you've already told them. I've listened to some of the shows when I could, but honestly, it's been very, very consuming with the ordeal that my family's dealing with. So I guess most people know now this was an incursion that started off with roughly 300 personnel of the Ukrainians. There were some RDK guys with well-trained Ukrainian units. They broke in. They even took Russian prisoners. Almost all of them are conscripts. Um, and many thought that that was it. And then I think later on in the same day, if not the next day, about 1,000. So almost like a third of a brigade. I mean, a lot of Ukrainian brigades now are only about 2,000 instead of a typical 3,500, 4,000, 4,500. Nonetheless, about 1,000 came in, and like the previous assault with a lot of armored vehicles, this time they drove as much as they could. Ukrainian prisoners that have been caught. It's been just a day over a week since this started. Believe it was August the 6th, or it's been exactly a week. Yeah, a day over a week. And what they were basically told was to drive as far as possible. And a lot of those tactics are still being used, and we will get into it. Maybe the most devastating blow for the Russians, I think, in terms of manpower, was the HIMARS hit that happened, I think, August 7th or 8th. And this was a column that was moving 13 trucks. Um, they stopped. They were close to one another. You would think like the general staff of the Russians would have learned because, the last mass casualty event that happened was in May. And, here we are 3 months later, another mass casualty. Very unfortunate. From the footage, the HIMARS strikes, at least 4 or 5 missiles kept landing, I would say, within a 50-meter radius at the most. So the casualties were not as high as they could have been. Some of the trucks did not have any soldiers in, of course. Looking at the footage of a Russian driving through this road, it's obvious that some of the trucks did, and there were many bodies inside. Bodies on next to the trucks, some of the corpses burnt. The initial estimate was about 150 casualties, 50 wounded, 80 dead. And then Weeb Union has contacts both with the Ukrainians and the Russians, and they confirmed those numbers. So very, very unfortunate. Of course, the lead up to this incursion was that the Russians themselves wanted to invade Sumy after that small breach that the Russians still have in in Kharkov, in the area of Lipsy and Vovchansk. What they did is they spent a month clearing mines, and that did not go undetected by the Ukrainians. And they waited really for the right moment. I would say that the big giveaway to the Russians might have been that their demining vehicles were probably not being attacked. And as it turned out, yesterday there was news that Gerasimov and the general in charge of this region of the North Group was told 2 weeks in advance in July that the Ukrainians were planning an incursion that he did not respond to. Now, you're saying, well, didn't Russia have thousands of troops in that area? They did, yes, but not on the border. They had them in Kursk proper and some of the villages further out, because in this war, everything is monitored. And so very rarely is there any hopes of a surprise attack. Moreover, you cannot show any concentration of forces. It is only when one side or the other is committed to making the attack that they pour in ever large amounts of men and material that they're willing to risk, and whatever kind of backup forces they have in mind to follow them. So the Ukrainians picked the absolute perfect opportunity to make this incursion. They got nearly 200 square miles in the first day, and then now they're basically somewhere around 750, 850, 900 square kilometers. And we'll look at the map that I sent you. So you can go to the first map. This is where the incursion has happened. The Ukrainians, of course, came out of Sumy. And you can see that today they've made further progress. Now, some of these areas, the Russians have taken back some areas. So let's say in the last 72 hours. However, what you're looking at is the most up-to-date image I have from today, which is Wednesday, August the 14th. If we go to the second slide, you're going to see something interesting that hasn't been done before. And of course, Weeb Union, these are from Weeb Union's channel. His maps are based on Syriac maps, and what Syriac maps has done is it's made the map reflect what the incursions are like. So the first forces are attack forces. They just keep going. They will go into a village. They will find places to entrench themselves. If there's no forces there, and act as an ambush unit. If there are forces, Russian forces there, a part of the team will engage them, and the other team will just keep going, right? And if this sounds like what Russia was doing at the beginning of the SMO in February and March 2022, it's because it is. And so a lot of these areas, what you're looking at in the second slide I showed you, this long protrusion, you notice how it's not colored. It has a blue outline, but it's not colored blue. And that's because there are special ops in this area that are Ukrainian, but there are also Russian forces there. So it's not ground that's consolidated. The tip of it, of course, has a blue gun symbol. That is to say that there were armored vehicles and men of the Ukrainians who made it there. They were hit, they were killed, but those aren't the only units. And to the left of that, you can see the areas where they have ingrained themselves further. This was in Dorovka. The Russians took that village back, but today they've lost half the village, as you can see. If you go to the next slide, this gives you a better overall image of where things stand on, let's say, the northern and western side of this incursion. What the Russians are probably most concerned about right now is the town of Korenovo. If the Russians lose Korenovo, which is to the right, it is sort of that the incursion in the middle, so to speak, the tip of it. Without that, the Russians will have a very difficult time to fight them back without sending more reinforcements. Now, the Ukrainians, according to the New York Times, of course, has sent in many brigades into this area. There are at least 4 or 5 brigades now. Some of those brigades were from Chasiv Yar. The Russians have only sent 1 brigade from Chasiv Yar. Everything else is business as usual. And we will look at other maps to show what kind of progress the Russians are making. So let's go to slide number 3. It's slide number 4, the last one for the Kursk region. And you can see this is another incursion that the Ukrainians have made. Again, it's not colored blue, it's not solid, because these are small forces as opposed to the dark blue with the blue interior. This also basically tells you that the Russians still don't have that many forces, and the places where they're going to entrench themselves are probably outside of this red zone, in my opinion. And I think now with the maps out of the way, we can probably talk about, why did Ukraine do this? Because there's been several articles. The New York Times has been covering this really well, and they had an article today, and all of them are even Reuters and Politico are kind of wondering, how good is this strategy? Is it worth it? I mean, I think it's only 8 days old, but obviously, the first thing that I thought of was they're doing this for a few reasons, not in any order, but I'm going to mention them. Raise the morale of the troops in terms of like getting revenge. Now, there's videos where the Ukrainians openly state this, and there's interviews with other frontline Ukrainian soldiers in Donbass who were very happy. Well, they were fairly happy. Some of them were not. Those in Chasiv Yar and in the Pokrovsk front, Ochertina, Konstantinovka are not happy. They're basically saying, we've had a shortage of men and materiel for months and months, basically for all of 2024. And this is where it's going. So, yes, there are some soldiers that are very happy about it and others that are very disappointed. Ukrainian officers, some of them speaking on the basis of anonymity, are wondering if this was a good bet. And the author of the article, whose name escapes me now, is also asking that because basically says the only way this thing could work, the Ukrainians have said sort of ad hoc reasons in the days following the incursion that we're doing this for better bargaining at the inevitable settlement, peace settlement.
They even had that deep fake of Zaharova saying we'd be willing to exchange territory in order to drive Ukrainians out of Kursk, which completely fake AI.
Yes.
And then they've also, I don't think they went as far as AI, but there's been Ukrainian media outlets and other affiliated media outlets who put out statements that Putin is willing to concede X, Y, and Z if it means getting the Ukrainian forces out of Kursk. So there's been as much of an information war as a ground
Yes.
war
Yeah.
since this offensive started about 8 days ago, as of time of recording.
Right. And also fake signs like they've reached, not to be confused with Lvov, but Lgov, which
Oh,
is a town at,
or the best one where they photoshopped the sign to be 10 meters away when it was 10 kilometers away when it was 100 kilometers away, and they changed the spelling from the Russian spelling of Kursk to the Ukrainian spelling of Kursk.
wow, patriots to the end. Uh, so anyways, that was one of them. Then another ad hoc reason that was summed up today was, we're going to take the Kursk nuclear power plant, right? Now, I don't doubt that because you remember way back April, May, we were talking about, you know, Ukraine is getting new funds, new weaponry. What are they going to do with it? Where are they going to go? And we were sort of at a loss, like where. One of the places that we brought up was, making an incursion to the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant in Ukraine that the Russians control, because remember that the dams have been broken, and so now it's easier to get across. Yes, they would have to be fighting uphill, but remember how many times that the Ukrainians tried this, not just with shells and HIMARS and artillery and jets, but you know that has always been like a kind of a blackmail that the Ukrainians could do, like that it could add pressure. Another one was, of course, invading Transnistria. That's another one that they pull out of the hat once in a while. And I'll give it to History Legends assumption several months ago, where he said, my guess is that they're going to go north if they don't go into these other areas. But I remember him mentioning that. I don't know if we mentioned that they would make an incursion. Um, we might have, but my idea was the small scale RDK stuff that they did in Belgorod. That always ended in, honestly, it ended in disaster. Um, not that Russian forces didn't suffer. I have seen video footage from the Ukrainian side where you see a BMP-1 and what I think is a Russian tank whose a turret has been blown off. But the Ukrainians lost a lot more, based on the anecdotal video footage that I saw. So
And to put it bluntly, not to downplay the loss of human life here, the Russians can afford to lose more.
yeah, yes, they can. Um, but the thing that the Russians have going for them for nearly a year now are the glide bombs. Actually, they've had it for over a year, but the kind of glide bomb campaign that they've had for about 10 months now has really been quite something. It is really what has allowed them to move the the front line forward, or in this case, westward. Now, that said, one of the things we always mentioned on the show, just when the war started, was the Ukrainians will be happy to hold on to any territory as long as possible in the Donbass and in areas that are under Russian control, because to dislodge them will mean destroying the town. And I don't think this is any different. Now, the area that the Ukrainians are controlling right now has a density about 37 people per square kilometer. In Donbass, it's 157. So much, much more dense. Kursk is a city of 400,000 people. Donetsk City is more than twice that. It's like 1.2 million or 1.1 million. It's at least 1 million, at least,
Yes.
even if you count for the people who have left. And now it's really a city that's an occasional attack, but it's, ever since the Russians basically took Avdiivka and Ochertina, like that has really, the amount of attacks have really decreased. So there's probably several reasons that the Ukrainians are doing this, and a lot of people are basically saying this is a waste of time. It was spectacular for the first 2, 3 days. Yes, gains are continuing, but at a much slower pace. And they have mentioned that the losses have been high for the Ukrainians. And both sides have a good deal of prisoners as well. So, I guess time will tell. Like I say, it's only 8 days old. My feeling is that, based on the way Putin looked at Gerasimov in that meeting, this is very important to them. They cannot allow it to expand much further. And that Gerasimov has messed up. Again, I do not doubt that in the, let's say, medium to long term, Gerasimov will be relieved.
Well, since the beginning of the year, or actually since Putin's new administration began after the March elections, there has been a slow move to remove almost everyone Prigozhin criticized before his
Yes.
March. And of course, Prigozhin, as far as we know, is dead now. Now he might be living under an assumed identity in Belarus for all we know. One might be able to hope, one might be able to dream of such a thing. But as far as we know, he's dead right now. But it does seem like that almost every criticism he brought up is being addressed down the road. And you do notice this when it comes to protests across the world. You could go to any point in history where typically there's a crackdown against any sort of dissent, against any sort of uprising against the state. That happens, that's put to rest. And later down the road, those concerns are addressed. And it does look like that is happening now because I don't think anyone, regardless of whether they thought Prigozhin was in the right or wrong to pull his stunt, thought that he was factually wrong about any of this. And sure, you could have said it was an ego trip. You could have said it was for his own personal gain, in which case it may very well have been. But point being is, what he brought up was factual, and we are seeing the consequences of that play out now. And I don't want to put a time frame on it, but Gerasimov, especially after this crisis, I think is done. Now, whether that's a peaceful dismissal, it probably will be, or one of these dismissals where they try to bring him up on charges like you've had with some of the lower-ranking officers, I don't know. Like I said, I'm leaning towards it being a more peaceful dismissal. Uh, and if you really want to put on your tinfoil hat, you could say this was allowed to happen to have an excuse to sack him. I think that is going a little bit too far. How,
Yeah.
however, I will say on the other side, because we all know that projection is the name of the game with the Ukrainians, I could see Zelensky allowing this in order to throw Syrskyi under the bus, saying this was his operation, this was his idea. So when it falls through, Syrskyi's out because Syrskyi and Zelensky have also been at odds pretty much since he assumed Zelensky's role about 6 months ago.
Yeah. I mean, there's another take. I noticed Dima of Military Summary said that now I don't know how much weight I want to put into this. Zelensky cannot make a peace agreement because he's technically not the president of Ukraine because there were no elections,
I
et
don't think
cetera, et
that's
cetera.
stopped him from doing anything before.
I know, and the Americans would disagree with that. So Because of this, um, he will draft a new constitution because their constitution stipulates that they cannot take over Russian territory. And this new constitution will provide laws that change the constitution, that have some kind of amendment process, and that will reinstate that he is actually still the president, and blah 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 blah. I don't know how much Zelensky or the Americans or the EU or NATO care. To be honest, we may, like, I think even that this was part of a bargaining strategy is fake. I think the biggest reason why they made this incursion was to stop the progress of the Russians, particularly in the Donbass area of Pokrovsk, because now really it's become the Pokrovsk front, because the Russians are less than 15 kilometers from Pokrovsk.
And they've
They're
also saved Sumi several weeks, if not months.
Yes, you know, the Russians are just that much closer to Pokrovsk than they are to Avdiivka. And now we can sort of get into some more maps, and we can see why Pokrovsk is probably so important. So the first slide shows you where Pokrovsk is and where the Russians are. So that's about 15 kilometers away. You can see that there's some small red lines that represents the gains that they made today. The bigger outlines are in the last 2 days. So they're moving forward, not like the Ukrainians are in the Kursk region, but this is a very densely populated area. Four times more dense than Kursk, with, as you can see, all the yellow outlines. Those are all fortifications. And Kursk only has, I mean, really, there's only 2 or 3 fortification lines. There are no fortifications.
And not only are
We
these fortifications, we're getting into the territory that the Ukrainians began fortifying in 2014.
That's right. That's right. Most of these fortifications are from 2014. So if you go to the second map, you can see a topographical view. And you'll see the railroad line, and I have Pokrovsk circled, just as I did in the map above it, the regular map, the non-topographical map. The Russians are basically where that dip in the railroad goes, right? And you can see that the reason they've chosen to fight is the highest ground. Pokrovsk itself is not bad. It's not in a valley. It's decent. It's not high, but you could do worse. Bakhmut, for instance, was in a valley. That's a difficult town to take, no matter which side is holding it. And slide 3, the one after the topographical, is a blow up, and you can see in this next one an image of all the fortifications that the Russians have captured, including the ones that they've captured today. Again, the light lilac outline is the gains that they have made in the last 2 days, which are fairly significant. And I think this is why the Ukrainians are afraid of, like, what would be the repercussions if they lost Pokrovsk. Now, the next slide, this arrow gives you an idea of the course that the Russians are going to take to get to Pokrovsk. Of course, south of where they are at the moment, they will have to consolidate those areas. But you can see that the amount of defensive lines afterwards are much fewer. There are larger towns, 2 or 3 of them around Pokrovsk, that the Russians will have to engage in. Now, if we could, I have ignore the next slide in the third series of slides for now, and go to the second last one, and this will be important. So this is basically the strategy that the Russians are going to employ when and if they take Pokrovsk. After they take it, there are no fortifications anymore. And you can see that long line that stretches westward is goes to the town of Dnipro. Dnipro is a big town. It is at least 500,000.
Is that Kolomoisky's hometown?
I think it might be. I think it might be. And if I'm not I don't know if Zelensky comes from Zaporozhye or not, but he's from this area. Zelensky is. So you can see what the Russians want to
Yeah,
do is they
Krivia
want
Nogidiot, as Zaluzhny once called him.
to. so so you can see what they want to do is they want to reach Pokrovsk. They want to deal with less fortifications, and essentially they want to encircle the Ukrainians. The reason Pokrovsk is so important is because from it, just the way you see the lines radiating, it is a logistics hub for all the Ukrainian forces in this region. If it falls, the Ukrainians will have to use other ways of getting everything there. Now, if we go to the last slide, you can see the roles at the town of the Dnepr and Zaporozhye. These are the two highways basically that they utilize to go to Pokrovsk. Um, that is why the Russians want this. It's a key. This will be the most important battle in the Ukrainian war, and I'm guessing by the end of September, the Russians will definitely be there. They will be fighting it. Um, I think the Ukrainians know this. There's even rumors that basically the Ukrainians have given up on taking any of these settlements back. They know they cannot conquer Donetsk city or Lugansk or Gorlovka or Mariupol again. They're too big. They're too well entrenched now. They can keep the Russians at bay from expanding or make it costly for them. But really, the pace that the Russians are going since 2024 is such that is going to become more difficult. And if we go back last year to the Ukrainian spring summer offensive, what was their offensive? That they would divide Zaporozhye in two, cut off Mariupol from Kherson, and from there they could bombard all of Crimea and, I don't know, destroy the Kerch Bridge, and that would make logistics impossible for the Russians, even though they have a ferry system, right? That didn't. So the Ukrainians have always thought of like some, incredibly daring um, move that, if executed perfectly, will get the results they want. Everything else will collapse afterwards, and it's done, right? And in many ways, the Kursk incursion is the same. If we get to the nuclear power plant, if we tie up Russian forces here, we will buy time, and if we can threaten them into like a nuclear event, uh, then then it's over. They'll bargain with us. This is really the only way they can win without NATO intervening, and I think in many ways this basically says that NATO is not going to intervene, at least not now. I don't think the willpower is there. Um,
Even the biggest hawks don't have the appetite for this. I mean, let's take a look at the United States first off. The leadership crisis. Biden is in his lame duck term. Everyone has accepted that he's too impotent to be running the country. You have an election between, as far as I would say, the establishment of Europe is concerned, two very lackluster candidates for their goals, in terms of especially the very pro-Ukraine people. Not that, I mean, look, let's be honest, both of them probably would continue the status quo, but it simply wouldn't be enough given the circumstances we're looking at. The UK is in its own mess. Germany's economy is slowly but surely continuing in decline, as is the rest of Europe. There's really nobody to coordinate an effort that would have anywhere near enough steam to succeed at shoring up Ukraine. Whereas I may have said back in 2022, they'll cajole Poland and Romania into shoring up Ukraine's defenses. I think we're even beyond that. And looking at the attitudes in some of these countries that would be the so called second wave, sure, they'll talk all this, they'll bring up all this ethnic tension against the Russians, the Poles bring up all their historic grievances, etc., etc. But on the ground in these nations, none of these people really have the stomach to want to actually fight this war, especially on behalf of Ukrainians. It's
Yeah.
the the motivation is not there, even among the most virulent anti-Russia factions in Europe. The motivation is not there. The steam is not there.
Yeah, and particularly among Western European nations, particularly them. And of course, many of those in Eastern Europe, the forces are just not that big, with the exception of Poland. But remember, they would have to go in. They would have to go into Ukraine to fight. Now, just to wrap things up on the front line, if that slide that we skipped, if we could just go to it, the one that says three other areas, just beneath the first one beneath it. This is the fighting taking place yesterday. There were some significant gains by the Russians. You can see them here in the lilac outlines. This is fighting in the New York and Toretsk direction. The Russians are just on the outskirts of Toretsk, and of course they've conquered over half of New York easily. They're fighting from the Gorlovka direction. This is an area just north of Deivka. It's very, very close. So, and there were two other units that were now there were two units that were taken from Chasiv Yar and placed here, and they took off, and that might have been some of the reasons why they lost some significant territory here. And then this same unit was also placed to invade the Kursk area. So yeah, I think they need like some kind of, like, they're never going to conquer back anything to the 91 border. They can't do it. Europe can't do it. The US can't do it. So they need to find that, that weak spot where they can do something so extraordinary, so threatening that the Russians buckle. But the Russians haven't buckled, and in many ways, it was the same. It was a similar idea that the Russians would buckle, that the Americans thought, if we sanction them hard enough, if the war is grinding and bloody enough, they're going to buckle. They're going to give up. And that didn't happen either, right? It has actually just made them more determined. So things aren't really going their way. And, we'll have to keep an eye on what is happening in Kursk. And, just slightly off topic from the front lines, but apparently the guy that blew up the Nord Stream pipeline was in Poland, and he's taken off. They don't know where he is. This is one of the most absurd and stupid stories
Mr.
I've
Volodymyr Z.
yeah, this is one of the stupidest stories I've ever heard from Ukraine in the West ever. Like, you're supposed to, again, this is like this little yacht, five people go down like, it's preposterous. The Americans, it didn't matter whether it was Blumpf, it didn't matter whether it was Biden. They all wanted to stop the pipeline because, like, just as a bigger strategy, right? Like, yes, the Americans would like Europe to get oil and gas from Russia or the territory that's currently called Russia, but they would like that territory to be broken up into at least 5 or 6 nations, preferably 10. And they want to make the profits on that gas and oil, right? It's not that they don't want it, it's like they don't want it as it is. And
They don't want the
real
Russian state to have the political leverage and economic leverage that comes with controlling it. They want that for
yes,
themselves.
yes, yes, that's precisely it. And you know, yes, to an extent, the Americans wanted to wreck Europe in order to bring it closer to them, so that Europe no longer has the amount of autonomy which was already compromised, let's say during Merkel's time as chancellor. They want a Europe with even less autonomy, right? But the payoff was going to be that you were going to get Russia. You were going to get the resources. America would commandeer that, right? And that hasn't happened yet. And probably, you know, part of the reason why there's this emphasis on Iran and, going after Iran to make a move, right? Because, like, I guess we're eventually going to get into Iran and Israel and all that. Is the way the West looks at it, this axis of Russia, China, Iran, to a lesser extent India, but India is important in the kind of Thucydides trap that the Americans have set up for the Chinese. We'll expand on that. Basically, the weakest link is Iran, right? They would like, if they could destroy Iran and Iran's you know dual control of both the southern Caspian Sea and the Persian Gulf, that would be great, right? That's the weakest link. And that would compromise certain things for both the Chinese and the Russians, right? So I think one of the reasons why Iran is, like, let's say, holding off from a proper attack, although it has to be said that, over 94,000 Israeli Jews are displaced. Over 62,000 from the north have left, right? One third have said they're not coming back. Portugal has introduced dual visas so that, when this is over, if they so choose, they can go back. So, I mean, the Israeli Jews do not have the stomach, no matter what they say, to live in Israel in the same way that the Palestinians do to live in Palestine. The amount of suffering between the Palestinians and the Israeli citizens is not comparable at all. And the Palestinians are far more determined to stay there. This is why the Israelis have to be genocidal, because they know their own population has much lower tolerance. But the way this fits into the larger geopolitical picture is because, Netanyahu's getting a lot of pressure. His military staff has just told him today, another article in the New York Times saying, you're not going to defeat Hamas. And really, like, you're going, what's it? Either you um, get a wider war, right? Or you make a deal with them. And Iran basically is thinking, if we retaliate for, how do you pronounce his name? Hemenia. If you
Hania, yeah.
Hania, if you retaliate for him, what will Israel's response be? And I think this might, like, the military planes from Russia that have been flying into Iran, I think are basically air defense systems. And I think both the Americans and the Israelis know this. and Iran could be waiting for the right time. Iran has proven that they could use like their lower quality missiles to reach Israel. The Houthis, of course, have already attacked Israel proper on several occasions. One was this, drone that killed the former IDF guy in his apartment, but in Tel Aviv, there were two missiles that landed right on the highway, and that was from Yemen, a real like distance away. It would be comparable to the Russians sending a missile from Crimea. Like it's a long distance. So
And that's
I would
across either Saudi Arabia or the Red Sea with no interception.
right, right. Now, you know, I mentioned India and why India is there to act as a kind of trap for China. Let's say that maybe some kind of a showdown, maybe it'll just be a proxy war between China and America is inevitable, right? What China is afraid of is that um, India will reap the rewards of being on the sideline. Now, that's a strategy. It's a theory. I've read certain, certain works that claim that that is a concern. Um, a war between America and China would be devastating. It would, probably eclipse what is happening in Ukraine. Um, India would benefit from it, and it's also probably one of the reasons why the Americans have repeatedly tried to court India to pull it away from that sphere of Russia and China. Um, and even Russia might be concerned about this. Um, so that's an interesting prospect because Xi Jinping in 2013, um, he was citing certain authors. Well, he wasn't repeating their words per se, but authors like Sorokin and Turchin, which are both Russian professors who emigrated to the U.S. after the First World War, after the Russian Revolution, and they basically taught like theoretical history and history based on mathematics. And there are current Russian writers who also think in those terms. Um, to put it, if I could just put it broadly and generally, and maybe a bit crudely, think of Arnold Toynbee and Oswald Spengler. Think in that sense of looking at patterns within history that repeat themselves, right? And some of them are very, very mathematical, and they look at cycles that reemerge over and over again, and others have for lack of a better word, more esoteric. So um, I would, Xi Jinping's statement, he made that really at the commencement of announcing his Belt One Road policy. Um, so that was a kind of a signal not just to the Chinese and the Communist Party and the citizenry, but really to the Americans and the rest of the world, how they viewed their spot in history, what their ambitions are, right? And they're very proud. They had like 100 years of humiliation, but they've always seen themselves as a kind of a cradle of civilization. Iran is in this group as well. These are, you know, they're not going to go away. These two countries, these two peoples, they will find ways to remake themselves.
And I suppose if you
Uh,
want to go back to the China issue and bring that back around to more recent events, the regime change that just happened in Bangladesh
yes,
is really key to all this when you look at
it is.
China's trade routes through both land and the Indian Ocean, where you do have, yes, this uh, uneasy agreement between China, mostly through BRICS, through the effort of Russia, and setting themselves against the current American led order. And then you have Bangladesh, which has been a key member of this One Belt One Road, along with Pakistan as well, the two countries flanking India. Neither of which, especially Pakistan, are on good terms with India. So China has, in a way, played both sides of that. You do have this regime change happen in Bangladesh, seemingly overnight. Now, at first, I wrote it off. I figured this was just one of those revolving door revolutions that you get in that part of the world. But looking further into it, into some things that have happened since then, it does look like that they are trying to put the screws down on China right now as a result of many things, and I would say one of them is largely because of the progress of both the war in the Middle East and in Ukraine, China being such an economic engine that you can't really say supporting both of them because it's not a direct support, but that is still trading, that is still talking, that is still on friendly terms with both Russia and Iran, which are supposed to be under these harsh American sanctions regimes. And while they have shown before, even without the extent of cooperation with China that they have now, they can survive that. The reason that Russia is able to have such great economic growth as it is, and the reason why the Iranians are able to make such a footprint as they are, is because of access to the Chinese market. It is a roundabout way onto the global market. Now, there are other middleman countries, India, in fact, being one of them. India is also on relatively good terms with the Iranians. The Indians are really at the center of the I don't know what you call it, the struggle for polarity, whether that be a more unipolar vision on the American side or, for lack of a better word, a multipolar vision on the BRIC side. India is really at the uh, center of that struggle, and they do have power to be kingmaker. And right now, Modi is playing his position very well. Love the man, hate the man. He is willing to sit down with the Russians and make deals with them and
Yeah.
buy arms from them. But
He's the
especially
Hindu Erdogan.
that is a frightening thought. I you're right, but it's that is not fun to think about. Uh, Whereas at the same time, he is also able to do that with the Americans. I mean, he went to a Trump rally, and Trump had a rally in India. Do you remember the what was it the Namaste Trump thing that he went to India
Yeah.
in like 2019? That was ridiculous. But I mean now so with the U.S. Under Biden, with the real clear lack of leadership, you do have India more solidly with the Russians. Not to mention, India and Russia have pretty good relations going all the way back to the Cold War. Post independence India and the Soviet Union established very strong relations, despite the fact that India was never really aligned with one bloc or another. It was always far more sympathetic to the Soviet bloc. But with that going forward, I mean, you can talk about, yes, the issues between India and China. The relations are terrible between them, and they are at each other's throats. But they do find themselves in I don't want to call it an alliance of convenience, but they do find themselves in a cooperation of convenience that if the administration in Washington were a bit more competent and had not burned so much of its negotiating power over the past, say, 10, 15 years, they could exploit that gap. They could create a
Yeah.
rupture right there. And I mean, that right there, if they want to topple the growing amount of BRICS nations, that's the weak point right there. But there's nobody
Hmm.
in Washington with the political skill to do that. Now, what are we going to get Kamala Harris in office who's going to? Right now, she's a strong black woman, but the minute she takes office, she's going to be a strong Indian woman who's going to go and talk about common Hindu interests with Modi or whatever. I mean, that is a real possibility. Now, whether that would work, I don't know. Or we could see some sort of move against Modi in India and a new government take power there that is, say, much more aligned with the West. And I think one other question that we need to consider when we talk about India is their massive number of diaspora that are do very well for themselves. Say what you will about them. I'm sure that there are some very strong opinions on Indian diaspora in this chat. But in the Anglosphere countries, especially, uh, the amount of economic and even now growing social influence they command is nothing to sneeze at.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
especially in the coming decades, especially I would say over the next 10 years alone, we could see some real shifts inside of India and how they direct their country based on their relationship with the diaspora.
Right. One of the things that will probably baffle the Indian public is when Kamala's husband tells them that he texted her on their first date, show Bob, you know. It's kind of a reverse. You have, all these Indian men just salivating over Jewish women. It's kind of a reverse. He can really ingratiate himself to the, larger Indian public that way. But kidding aside,
But I
uh,
look, I appreciate the joke, but I will say also on the other side of the ticket, we're talking about a vice president, a potential vice president, who is married to an Indian, and if you listen to what he says about India, he has nothing but praise for it.
wow. Yes, I can see them really going out of their way to woo them. Now, to be honest, Modi is, you know, he's quite happy to offload as many Indians on the global, to other shores, as it were. Because as I mean, India is nowhere near and compared to China in terms of like sophistication at the moment, but consider India, right? It was under Mughal rule for hundreds of years. The British start coming in after the Portuguese. Basically, these guys just want to set up trade routes. They have skirmishes. Some of these outposts are killed and wiped out. You have different kingdoms vying, for protection, and then like this grows, and eventually Britain, as a way to make sure that it has the trade and the wealth, uh, has to eventually colonize India. But it wasn't so at the beginning. And then, you have Indian independence in the mid 20th century. And so, that's a kind of an awakening process for them because really they were under foreign rule, first under the Mughals, who were basically, you could say descendants of, Turkic Mongol mix with like, people in that area of northern India, Afghanistan, so on and so on. You can look at the depictions; they do look different than the other Indians, and of course they're Muslim. And so there is a kind of an awakening taking place. But one of the things that all these countries have in common, and this also includes Iran, and of course we already know it includes China and Russia, is they see that the trajectory, and we've been saying this, long before I read any material that basically confirmed what we were saying on the show as far back as late 2018 and 19. Um, all these countries are they know the trends where they're going in the West in terms of demographics and the kind of racial divisions that are inevitable in the West. They're very aware of it. They want to avoid war because they want the West to be at a point where it's so weak it cannot resist them. And they want to eventually rise to higher positions without a fight.
Yeah, I think that sums up a lot
Iran
of
is
it.
just as aware of this as anyone else. Yes, I know Iran. I know all these countries have demographic issues. I get it, right? But a lot of these countries also have huge amount of populations that, for instance, don't generate as much wealth. Like, how can I put it? Like the Chinese still, in terms of like how much energy they use per capita compared to the Americans when you equalize for population, there is still room for the Chinese, for instance, to raise more people to a higher standard of living, right? India has way more of that, as does Iran, right? And Iran has had to deal with very severe sanctions for 45 years, right? For nearly half a century. So, all of them want to climb out of this state. All of them have a past where they were much more feared and respected. Um, and they want to reattain that, basically. And they know that an all-out war with the U.S. Would harm them more than the U.S. It would harm the U.S. and it would certainly harm Europe. But time is running out, which is one of the things we always said for the West, and therefore the West will have to provoke a war.
Yes, and going back to my original point, like I said, that rupture line between China and India should be very easy to exploit, but there's nobody in the West with the political skill to do that. I'm not even saying insofar as an actual war breaking out, but putting them at odds against each other, even more so than they already now. But like I said, they've been forced. I shouldn't say forced, but they've been worked into this strange cooperation as a result of other interests at hand. And with what you're saying about the West, they do need some sort of break in this block because they tried this in Ukraine. They tried this with Russia. It hasn't succeeded. It's drawn them close together. They've tried putting pressure on China via Taiwan, but China hasn't budged. India, they're still too desperate to court. And the Iran issue, you have the Israeli. I mean, really, the biggest issue with Iran, the reason they cannot break that barrier, is because of the Israel lobby. And as far as I would say people actually concerned about the fate of the American empire, they should hate nobody more than the Israel lobby because right now, so many people in Washington are so beholden to them that they have to pursue this militant policy against the Iranians rather than say, look, I'm not trying to come out in some great defense of Barack Obama, as I'm sure you all know, but rather than pursue that line of thinking, rather than pursue the Iran deal with a soft conquest, with drawing them into the Western markets, drawing them into the Western sphere of influence that way, we have to put pressure on them. We have to continue the sanctions regime. We have to continue to isolate them, which only draws them closer to Russia and China, because Netanyahu is desperate to stay in power, and because there are enough people in the Israel lobby in the United States, particularly, I would say, of a leaning with the Likud party in particular, and other more right-wing factions in Israel, that are dead set on a confrontation with the Iranians and will not compromise for anything less. And like I said, we'll get into some of the more details about Middle Eastern news in a little bit here, but that's the position the West finds itself in, where it does have a lot of these countries that are disparate coming together under the common umbrella of really trying to reassert themselves after some sort of major defeat or humiliation, whether that be more distantly in the past or whether that be more recently in the past, say in the case of the collapse of the Soviet Union and Russia reasserting itself, trying to regather the strength that it once had, say, even 40, 50 years ago. And the West finds itself in this position because a lot of it is, of course, just raw power politics. Nobody wants to cede any ground. And then a lot of it's ideology where they can't compromise these people. But rather than try to realize where the tides are turning, which direction the wind is blowing, it is just full bore confrontation. We need to solve this problem with brute force, and there's no way that we can actually play into these dynamics and try to negotiate ourselves a position. And like I said, even just the slightest recognition that the West is in some sort of tumult or decline would go a long way in terms of maybe being able to secure some sort of arrangement with one of these powers or with one of these power blocks. Like I said, it won't be hegemonic anymore, but they can still secure their position and they can still reap the benefits of what is a rapidly changing world. And like I said, that's not an argument that the West has to abandon all of its interests and throw that all away in order to acquiesce to the new world order led by China or whatever, as some people might have you believe. But point being is, we're choosing to sacrifice our interests anyway in order to pursue a confrontation that, from the looks of it, what we've seen so far with the issue in both the Middle East and Ukraine, that we're not winning anyway, and we're only squandering our resources, and seemingly accelerating our decline.
Yeah, I mean, a bit the kind of India, sorry, the kind of India that America wants would ostensibly mean an India whose membership in BRICS is either null and void or has no depth. It would have to be, like, to use a comparison, something worse than Hungary's place in the EU. Except the difference, of course, is India is one of those places in BRICS that is, first of all, it's an original member. Second of all, it has a lot to gain by being in BRICS. And it's going to play this game between its membership in the BRICS and and its closeness, let's say, with the Brits and the Americans for all it's worth. Um, it knows that deep down inside, it doesn't really have. I wouldn't say it has nothing to fear from China, but it doesn't have anything at the moment to fear from China because it can utilize BRICS to rise at a certain level where those kinds of fears would be assuaged. And um, I don't know if the Americans, what do they have to offer the Indians? Um, I don't.
Aside from some sort of social engineering, I know a lot of people will, and ourselves included, will say the only thing America has to offer is gay pride parades. I mean, yeah, it's a joke, but in many ways, the only thing that we have to offer is NGO liberalism, where we can promise certain subsets that society you can enjoy your lifestyle of being, a gay or a feminist or whatever, so long as you align yourself with the American power bloc, and that's really the only thing that we have to offer.
Right, right. And in a sense, what the Americans are trying to do is what they've basically succeeded in doing in Western Europe, and that is capture a generation. And, like, let's say Baerbock. By the way, have you heard Baerbock, Baerbock's black boyfriend? Or
I've not heard it, but I'm not surprised.
there's this phenomenon of, like, middle-aged German women going to Africa for, like, sex tourism. It's so pathetic. She's really young to start doing that. Usually it's these, like, fat women in their 50s and 60s, I still got it. Like, they're paying for it. Anyhow, um, they want to capture a generation, so that's why they're sort of holding on. That's why they will, like, the West will never give up on woke stuff. That is their, like, that's their religion.
Yeah, it might be less intense. It might take a different form. They might give up on some of the more ridiculous elements, but if we're talking just the idea of liberalism or for liberation, as one may put it, they're not going to give up on that. And uh, we've gone over this many times before. A lot of it is not only the fact that, yeah, they do benefit in pushing from this, but the main benefit here is the fact that it creates an undyingly loyal fifth column in any given country.
Yeah.
Because, once again, a lot of these people have a lifestyle that is dependent on some sort of hyper liberal state existing in order for them to live the way they want to. Like you just said with that very interesting news about Baerbock that I was not actually aware of. But once again, in uh, a much more, let's just say, for lack of a better word, traditional society, she couldn't have that kind of lifestyle and be a minister in the German government. And
Yeah.
even the question of a woman being a minister in the German government, while not impossible, it would take a far different form than what it looks like now in terms of if we did live in a much more traditional society, or the Germans did have a much more traditional society. But like you said, they're trying to create a generational capture where these people are beholden to the civic religion because that's the only thing the West has to sell now. The economic prosperity of the post war era, where America was the sole standing manufacturing power, is gone. And a lot of that was through a matter of what is really bribery. We sent our industry to Mexico, to China, in order to bribe them throughout certain points in the Cold War. And then once we gave up our long-term economic leverage for short-term gain, and of course, naturally, a lot of the world would have recovered its industrial capacity anyway, but a lot of American industrial capacity was lost because of that. And secondly, because when it comes to dynamics in America, when it comes to power politics, it disempowered the regional elites. Whereas before, you could have somebody from, say, the South or the Midwest or the Western United States who controlled some sort of regional business or regional manufacturing, or had a corner in the industry. He could command politics from that regard. He could command power from that regard, and maybe even eventually work his way up through the system, through the American empire, leveraging his regional power. It has disempowered those people and made them completely dependent on the center of the American empire. We're to the point where there are no regional elites in America anymore. It's despite it being officially a very decentralized country, effectively it is a very centralized country. And then they're trying to, of course, export this model towards other countries as well. And going back to the point we made about Europe, about more or less deindustrializing them because we can't have them buying gas on Russian terms and it has to be on American terms. It also disempowers whatever national or regional elites existed in Europe as well, to where the point where if you want power in Europe, it's a matter of alignment with Washington, alignment with Brussels, and alignment with the Atlanticist order. And that is really the only uh, incentive America has to offer, where it breaks up the local power blocks, centralizes the power out of Washington, and then doles it out to the most loyal factions. Now, that's not unique for empires. All empires have done that at some point. But in terms of what we have to dole out now, it let's just say it becomes less and less enticing as time goes on.
Mm. I mean, you see a snapshot of this in 2024 with reference to the country of Georgia, right? So they overcame their president. The parliament passed their foreign agent laws. They have now passed a law against, you know, gay education, gay adoption, so on and so on. And, you know, the EU is furious. America is furious. But this was an example of a place that the youth in that area, like, they're still going to have hope, but their numbers aren't high enough right now to flip things over, right? Because
And
ultimately in the West, what they want is a citizenry that is just obsessed with their sexual identity, themselves as an individual, because everything after World War II is about the expression of the individual. And anything else that is outside of those bounds, like shut up, don't interfere, it's none of your business,
stop trying to take us back,
e-
etc.,
e-
etc.
et cetera, right? No communal identity, no historical identity.
But it is interesting that you brought up Georgia and the idea of the youth who are invigorated by the idea of a Western liberal future, where you do get this in a lot of countries like Georgia, and you could even say Ukraine, even before the war, other parts of Eastern Europe, even Eastern Europe that has been subsumed by the West, say Poland, Romania, Hungary, whatever, where a lot of those bright-eyed liberal youths will just take the easy path and move to the West and live that lifestyle there rather than trying to import it into their home country. They'll throw up their hands, they'll give up and say, well, if we're all just individuals, what does it matter whether I live in Georgia or whether I live in Germany, France, the United States, etc.?
Yeah, yeah, and as long as we're in the Caucasus, we apparently the Azerbaijanis have stated that American troops have been transferred to Georgia,
Hmm.
and Israeli troops have left Azerbaijan. So this is kind of an issue. I always said this, and I won't mention the chat, but this chat I'm in on Telegram, there's an idiot. He literally he could be either a neocon or Bill Maher, and someone from his ethnic background. And I said, I said months ago that one of the reasons why Pashinyan has betrayed his country is because he sees that is the best path for him to integrate with the U.S. and Europe. And the guy put in a clown face. Like, what's so clownish about that? Like, here I am 2 weeks
mean,
later.
Pashinyan is a clown, but
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
aside
he
the
is.
point.
Yeah, and 2 weeks later, the American military has moved in. Like, they're already buying, American weaponry as we speak. Anyways, why wouldn't the Americans set up bases there? I mean, they already have now a NATO office, right? And this is the path that Armenia has chosen. It'll be interesting because, of course, the Iranians still want that corridor that links up with Iran, that separates Azerbaijan in two. So, anyways, I don't want to steer you too far off course.
No, no, but since you brought up Israel, since you brought up Azerbaijan, I suppose we should move on to the question of the Middle East and the impending, or supposedly impending Iranian attack, and just issues in the region in general. So, as you had mentioned earlier, it seems like the going narrative in Israel is Netanyahu either steps down or there's a regional war. And that is the only way he stays in power. And of course, there always is the
Yeah.
threat that Netanyahu will be prosecuted on the number of charges that were brought up against him if he is removed from power, if he does lose the immunity of the office of prime minister. And I mean, these were Israeli security officials that had told Netanyahu when it came to the choice that he had. He could either step down or there would be a regional war. And this is on top of the disputes he has been having with the IDF, where he has said some very insulting things about IDF officers. All while pressure increases, you do have the increasing amount of strikes out of Lebanon from Hezbollah. You have the threat of the Iranian strikes. The Iranians have held off for now. Of course, you had the Russian delegations visiting, and as you had speculated, probably bringing them air defense systems in anticipation for a wider war. You've had increased activity in Syria. I know that there's been a few Israeli strikes, and also that there has been some on the ground movement from some groups in Syria driving out SDF forces that are aligned with the Americans. Saudi
Yep.
Arabia, you have news out of Saudi Arabia where, although they're still continuing the reconciliation with Iran, they're also saying you had Mohammed bin Salman came out and said, "My life is under threat because I'm trying to normalize relations with Israel," and also also agreeing to shoot down any attacks against Israel as well. Of course, the Jordanians agreed to that as well, uh, and that they have more or less ceded their airspace to Israel in order to agree to that. But it is a matter of sitting and waiting. And you could argue, you could say the Iranians, they're just saber rattling. They don't actually have it in them to do it, and that this is all just posturing. Or you could say it's creating the intended effect of just creating complete uncertainty in the region where Netanyahu, his hands are tied. Israel's hands are tied. You still have the issue in Gaza, which has come to a halt, really. While you still do have the large amount of civilian casualties, while the Israelis haven't really made much effort to avoid those, of course, in terms of actually dislodging Hamas, in terms of actually dislodging the militants there, they've they've failed at that. And you still
Yeah, yeah.
have guerrilla attacks on IDF forces. In terms of casualty numbers coming out of Gaza from the IDF, you can never really get an official number on those, but unless you,
History legends at the end of July said that the Israelis have suffered just a little over 600 casualties.
yes, yes, he did. And I think it was either him or somebody else extrapolated that to what the equivalent of that would be for American losses in either of our Middle Eastern wars in recent history. I think it came out to something like it would have been the equivalent about like of what I think half of what we lost in Iraq in terms of when you adjust for population and just for troop numbers.
Yeah.
Maybe I have that figure off, but I know somebody had cited that, which was interesting. But even 600 officially being stated was
Yeah, like how
was
long
a
can
huge
this go
number.
on, right?
No, how
It's
long can it go on?
that's just after 9 months.
You're right. We haven't even gotten to a year yet, and we're
And you know
just
the other thing, forgive me for cutting you off,
go ahead.
but I think this was like what the Israelis and the Americans have done is brilliant in so much as trying to make Iran look weak for not retaliating. They've shifted the attention. But if you remember, back in June, Israel said that they're going to invade Lebanon. Well, it's 2 months, not 2 weeks, and they still haven't. And are they going to?
I would be hard pressed to believe that they would, and that I'm hard pressed to believe that they'll do anything in Lebanon except
Like, are
carpet
they going to
bombing it.
commit ground troops?
No, no, I
I,
absolutely not. I don't think they will commit ground troops, and
but
some
that's what they said that they would do.
that's what they said they would do, and some might not like this logic, but the line of logic I go on is look at their skirmishes in 2006 with Hezbollah. If they were taking those kind of casualties 18 years ago, the situation has not improved in their favor. They cannot sustain this. They would not be able to sustain a ground invasion. And then we look at what was it? Sunday, I believe, you had the supposed failure of the Iron Dome where you had Hezbollah strikes get past Israeli air defenses.
Hmm.
And the Iron Dome, some people have, funny enough, actually bought into the Israeli propaganda about the Iron Dome, saying this must have been deliberate. They must have been setting up for a false flag. There's no way it couldn't have intercepted these. But we've talked for a number of years that the Iron Dome is very oversold as an air defense system, and that when they claim 95% accuracy, it was probably 2/3 at most in terms of interception rates. And now you're talking about Hamas and Hezbollah both only have better missiles and they have more missiles, and that their relations with both Iran and Russia have improved. So, like I said, their power is increased while Israeli power has decreased. Israel has much less room to maneuver with, but also far more desperation. And to
Yeah.
return to some of the points that you brought up, you have something upwards of 100,000 Israelis internally displaced who have had to flee from northern Israel because of the skirmishes there, because of the impending operation, because of the Hezbollah operations. And that's on top of the Israelis who have left the country since October 7th. And also, I can't remember the figure, but it was something around the number of thousands of businesses have shut down in Israel after October 7th, and
Hmm.
that companies are leaving. And now, in terms of major multinational corporations, that hasn't happened, but smaller businesses are leaving. People are uprooting their lives. They're going to other places in the West, like to once again repeat, Portugal is one of the ones where they had that agreement. Uh, a lot of these people in Israel have family abroad in the diaspora, whether that be in the United States, whether that be in other parts of Europe, etc., where they have options. They can get out. They have places they can go. And one could argue that from the beginning of this, from the beginning of October 7th, from the beginning of Al Aqsa flood, the primary goal of the Axis of Resistance, so called, was to create a mass exodus of Israelis. And that was the only way they were going to win this. It was to shatter the myth of Israeli invincibility, which they have. Because previous attacks, even among the worst before, paled in comparison to October 7th. As Netanyahu himself told us, it was like 29/11s for Israel. He couldn't
Hmm.
help him. He couldn't help himself bringing up that figure. But Netanyahu's theatrics aside, he does have a point that it was a mass casualty event for Israel. But what he didn't mention is that the myth of Israeli invincibility has been put to rest forever, in my opinion. Whenever anyone thinks about the security of the state of Israel, whether they're pro-Israel, anti-Israel, whatever, they will always think of October 7th. They always think of the security failure on that day. Whether
Yeah.
that was deliberate, whether that was pure incompetence, regardless, it happened. Uh, Jews in the diaspora, Jews in Israel, will not see it as the bash, and they will not see it as this unassailable fortress, whether that be even from a religious perspective. A lot of them might have to reevaluate that. And that's also on top of just the demographic issues in Israel as well, was the point where they're now conscripting the Hasidic Jews. They're now conscripting the ultra Orthodox Jews who traditionally have very poor relations with the Israeli government. And you add that as yet another angle of pressure. And that, once again, this is all on top of, recall, even days before October 7th, 2023, you had massive protests in the streets throughout Israel, particularly in Tel Aviv, calling for Netanyahu's resignation over his judicial reforms in order to make himself immune from the law. And he's gotten that immunity. He's ruling by decree as it is. He's gotten his desired position, and he's not going to give that up, and he's going to drive the world to the brink of nuclear war if he has to in order to keep that. And I don't see any method for his
Hmm.
departure. And especially if we're talking about relations with the United States, once again, we have Harris, who we can expect more of the same, pretty much a carbon copy of Biden. Of course, right now she's playing more moderate on the issue because she has to win the Muslim votes in Michigan and Minnesota, and
Mm.
among other places, but particularly Michigan. And then you have Trump, who is just party line on Israel, as he's been from the beginning. I mean, mind you, we all know the Trump connection. We don't need to relitigate those over and over. Sure, he can say that he would organize some sort of peace deal. Sure, he can say that um, we can bring up his personal feuds with Netanyahu, or he can talk about the letter that Abbas sent him. But point being is, from what we've seen, he might drag his heels, but Trump is ultimately party line on Israel as well. So there's no change. Netanyahu will continue to act unabated unless domestic pressure boils over to the point where, I don't know, maybe the Israelis also copy American politics, have their own January 6th, and then remove Netanyahu by force. I'm not discounting that possibility, especially with how much tension has grown between IDF brass and the government. Because I can tell you, these guys in the IDF brass, I'm not saying they're any better, really, but they don't like Netanyahu, at least to this point, and they certainly don't like Ben-Gvir and Smotrich. They,
It's almost like they're. It's almost like Netanyahu is afraid. Like Netanyahu is afraid where all this leads. I mean, Israel has been like a personal project for this guy, just as it was for his dad, you know. And of course, it's personal because his older brother was the only fatality when they stormed that plane. And when Idi Amin had those hostages. It's all very deeply, deeply personal, and and there's more and more articles coming out that he at least knew something was going to happen. The idea that Netanyahu did not know about October the 7th until sometime between 12:30 p.m. till 1 p.m., a full 6 hours after, right? Like there were people on Telegram that knew like in the first 2 hours what had happened, but he didn't know because he was in the West Bank, and they had to move 1/3 of the troops from Gaza up there, or was it 2/3? It was a huge chunk. Because he was again, he was stirring up unrest there. He was marching on the Al-Aqsa Mosque, like breaking into it. It's just disgusting. Like, I mean, I'm not a Muslim, obviously, but like everybody understands this is just a provocation, right? I think initially he had an idea about how far he could go, and I mean, what was the whole point of his visit to America? 78 instances of applauses, 59 or 60 standing ovations,
having
right?
Mike
I
Johnson
mean,
threaten to arrest anyone who stood against him.
right. I mean, he's America's real boss. I mean, that's America's real president. Um, Maybe it doesn't give him carte blanche, but it gives him something close. However, we're everybody's still waiting. Like they're waiting for like when is he came over to America to like basically get the blessing for more armaments to go into Lebanon. right? Because as long as Lebanon can lodge those missiles, the Jews are not going to return to that area of Israel. They're going. In fact, they're leaving. Tel Aviv airport is uh, it's almost vacant, and tourism is way down. Israel depends on that. Um,
Pretty much every major air carrier across the world has suspended flights to the entire region at this point.
right, right. And so, and what was it, Smotrich last week? He said, you know, it would be moral of us to genocide the Palestinians in Gaza, but the world won't let us. It's moral.
He's such a mensch.
And then of course a few days later you hear about them like raping prisoners, and then their public loses their minds, like how could you arrest them? You're beginning to find out that Israeli Jews have a very different kind of morality than the kind you and I have.
No, it's unhinged. It's completely unhinged, and to the point where even the liberal diaspora, who for years made excuses for them, downplayed it, swept the issue under the rug, are starting to break with it. Now you could say that's generational, but once again, the traditional base of support for Israel, outside of let's just say boomer doomsday preppers in the United States, that being the diaspora, they're breaking with Israel at record numbers. And a lot of these pro-Palestine protests you saw throughout the spring and summer were led by liberal Jews, in large
Yeah.
part. And that just shows like I said, the amount of fissure that has taken place within their own community over this issue. And that really it's Washington signing Israel more or less a blank check that amounts to their actions right now. And the question is, how much longer can this afford to continue, especially in light of all the other issues right now? I do have to wonder, almost a year on, it's been about 10 months, how much the Ukrainian war effort has suffered as a result of support being diverted from Ukraine to Israel. I
Didn't Israel just get another something like 13 billion this
Something
week?
like that. And
Huge.
you you do have to wonder how much. Once again, not that I'm a Ukraine supporter or anything, but you do have to wonder how much support from Ukraine has been diverted to Israel, and how much has the front line suffered in Ukraine because of that, and how much ground has been lost to Russia, and how much egg has the collective West gotten on its face because of that, because Israel cried and got what it needed in order to continue on with one of the most harebrained policies in the world, really. This campaign in Gaza, and there's no end in sight. I can keep repeating that, but there's not. There's no mission objective, and the IDF, as I've mentioned before, they're losing patience with the administration because there's no clear objective beyond expulsion of these people. I mean, not that I think the IDF have these bleeding hearts who would be against that, but point being is, in large part, that's simply not a viable option, and even that is unclear what they're supposed to be doing there. And these Israeli men are getting killed, and for what is the question. For Netanyahu to stay in power is the answer, if anyone's being honest about that.
Yeah.
And the question is, what is the breaking point? And I've asked this about Ukraine before, and I think we're starting to see that in Ukraine with some of the progress there. But what is the breaking point where somebody in Israel, some faction of power, whether it be within the Knesset, within the IDF, within whatever other power block might be in the country, says Netanyahu enough is enough, and either kicks him out of the country or throws him in prison? Because that's what is eventually going to happen. If Netanyahu does not implement the Samson option first, he's either going to be living in exile somewhere in the United States, or he's going to be in a jail cell. Those are the only two possibilities that this ends in. And what will Israel look like by the end of that? What will the region look like by the end of that? It could look a whole hell of a lot worse than it is right now, and it's not looking too good right now.
Yeah, I mean it's not really in Iran's interest right now to make some huge retaliation.
No, no, time is on their side
Like
with that.
yeah, in terms of like, the world can think it's weak all it wants. Ultimately, Israel has not gone into Lebanon. Their population is leaving. Um, has America solved the issue with the Houthis? No. They're still paying 33% markup on all goods that do not go through. And mind you, these are Western and Israeli aligned ships. These are not like Chinese and Russian ships. That's creating quite a precedent, right? Um, the Americans are not going to drone the Houthis out of existence.
They've
Uh,
tried that for 10 years. This
the
operation is nothing new.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And so this is something that's just grinding away, and yeah, so um, yes, it doesn't look good for Iran. Yeah, I mean, but don't take your eye off the ball. I mean, it doesn't look good for Israel either. Uh, as you mentioned earlier, Hezbollah continues to attack them in the north. Now, the Israelis have lost more machinery up there, tanks, and so on, but only about 25, maybe 30 men at most. Most of the dead are in Gaza, and if you ever watch the YouTube channel Electronic Intifada, you'll see, I mean, if you're not on Telegram, because there are dozens and dozens of Palestine aligned Arab Muslim channels that shows, Hamas and Hezbollah, attacking IDF troops. Like they're not weakened. You know, Even guys like Ben Gavir and like some of the other, the military brass are saying this. So what are you going to do? Y- You know,
No,
No,
there's.
I also think it's quite interesting too that the British have formalized, that if Netanyahu and Gavir, I don't know about Bennett, if they step foot in Britain, they will be arrested.
I actually didn't know that they were going to go through with the warrants on that, but that
They
is.
did, and it's funny because that idiot Tommy Robinson, then he had his little protest. 2, 3 days later, you have the Welsh boy of African descent who murdered 3 children, right? So that's the framework, that's the chronology of events around that, right? I mean, yes, Britain is, going to kiss ass to Israel, Israel as the concept, right? But that doesn't exclude Netanyahu.
Oh,
I
absolutely.
mean, sorry, Netanyahu is excluded from that equation about their support for Israel. Yes, they'll support Israel, but obviously Israel is doing something at this moment where the next leader better not, or they'll rule them as war criminals, and they too will, and eventually, the only place they'll be able to go is America, right?
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with Israel, that it's just become bad optics. Their fundamental support for the country hasn't changed, it's just that it's becoming harder to support them when Netanyahu makes these outrageous demands and expects them almost immediately. Where before,
Yeah,
at least the Israelis had some tact, they could cover things up, they could write off some of the more egregious things that they did in both the Gaza Strip and elsewhere as just consequences of war. But now there's no getting around it, especially with Smotrich and Ben Gvir, the two most controversial men in Israel, being in the cabinet, being probably the last two loyalists of Netanyahu. It's no question at this point that while, of course, the Zionist project will continue, while the Israeli lobby will be strong enough in these countries to keep Israel from total destruction, Likud, the Jewish Power Party, all these other organizations will have to be sidelined in order for that project to continue, in order to play into the West narrative, really. Especially
hmm
in places like Europe and the UK, where you do have a growing population of Muslims. Now, we've seen before that what they exactly do against Israel isn't much compared to. I mean, we all know that the way the Muslims have behaved, just I would say in the past 20 years in regards to Israel versus other foreign conflicts, where you have the largest Muslim army in decades, if not centuries, amass on the border of Israel, and they march towards Damascus instead. That happened in 2011. Let's not forget that. Um, and while they, of course, they do have outrages about the issue of Palestine, about the issue of Israel, let's just say their reaction is very different towards that, and that's for a number of reasons. But point being is, Israel is bad optics, especially in the face of a diversifying West, and if Netanyahu has to be thrown under the bus in order to rectify that, then they will do that. And the only place that won't happen is the United States, because once again, even though they are becoming more of a minority, they still do have that unquestioning pro-Israel population within the U.S. who are willing to tolerate that.
Hmm.
But I mean, ultimately, like I find myself asking once again, what's the breaking point here? At what point does this project all come tumbling down? Is Netanyahu really going to escalate this to regional war? But here's the thing: the Iranians are not taking the bait because time is on their side on this issue.
Yeah.
They don't need, and in fact, you could make the argument that having the looming threat of a potential Iranian attack over Israel is the best thing that they could do. That it could be any day, it could be any moment that the Iranians strike back, so the Israelis always have to be on guard, and that they have to be ready in order to defend against this attack, have the air defenses prepped, have people in the shelters, where it does disrupt daily life in Israel, which makes the situation worse for Netanyahu, which makes the situation worse for the Israeli state, when day to day life is disrupted. Whereas compared to, I don't know, say Russia, another country that's at war right now, uh, I know that you've had the issues in Kursk, I know that you've had the issues along the border regions, but by and large, daily life in Russia is unaffected by the war in Ukraine. Whereas on the other hand, the Ukrainian power grid is completely reliant on Hungary and Slovakia, in which case we'll see the ultimate outcome of that, I would say, come September, because I think that's the deadline Orban had set for the reopening of the Druzhba pipeline, which becomes a whole nother issue when you go
Hmm.
back to that, where Kursk is a major hub of the Druzhba pipeline, and they control that infrastructure right now. And uh, Netanyahu, not Netanyahu, Orban, excuse me for that one, had said if the situation isn't resolved by September, there could be an energy crisis in Hungary. And the one trump card the Hungarians and the Slovaks have on Ukraine is the electricity, is the power grid, the fact
Hmm.
that they're plugged in their power grid. So we could see a situation like that. But once again, going back to the idea of war affecting the daily life of these people, Israel, who is the proactive party in this war, who spearheaded it. Yeah, you could talk about October 7th, you could talk about Hamas, but to the point of what this war looks like now, what this war has escalated to, Israel is the initiating party here. The people at home have had to suffer greatly because of it. And how much more are they willing to put up with in order to continue this project? I,
Yeah.
I have to wonder. And I have to wonder what it will look like, say, on the year anniversary after this attack. How many people would have left Israel? How many IDF casualties there have been? And what the real sustainability of this war effort is, especially going into the U.S. elections. Like I said, I don't think it's very consequential in terms of who wins with that, but Israeli behavior based on what they perceive the incoming administration to do could be everything. And like I said, whether or not that actually materializes, whether or not there is a material difference from the administration, probably not. But once again, what the Israelis perceive that difference to be is going to make all the difference in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, ultimately, what you know, what Israel wants is the population to come back. They want things to go back to the way they were during the Abrahamic Accords, and they could sort of grind and demoralize the Palestinians. I mean, ultimately, they will want to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I do believe that.
Well, especially
Uh,
with people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, the ones who are actually practicing religious Jews, it is a necessity. in order for their prophecies to be fulfilled, this place has to be leveled.
Yeah. I don't think. Ironically, I don't think Netanyahu is the guy. He may want to prepare that. He's not. He's not a religious guy. Um,
No, he doesn't even wear the yarmulke.
yeah. I mean, he's just too. He's very, very pragmatic.
And no, it's not going to be him. And I mean, who knows what this looks like? If this goes on long enough, in my opinion, this very well could be the undoing of Israel. If they keep pushing this, if they keep pushing the envelope on this issue, they will get to a position that they cannot get out of. And what will that look like? Is it anytime in the near future? I won't say, but I mean, although the Egyptians won't touch Israel as things stand, relations have gotten substantially worse. A lot of the progress towards a peace between them over the past 45 years uh, has degraded in a large degree. I wouldn't say dissipated, but has degraded to a large degree. And especially if you get enough, say, grassroots outrage from the populations in places like Egypt, you could see down the road, let's say, much more hardline governments in places like Egypt, in places like Jordan. Who knows what the situation will develop in Syria? If Syria does stabilize a bit more, it could be part of a front like that. And depending on how much power and influence Washington continues to wield over the next, say, decade, who knows what the Gulf states will decide to do? The Gulf states could very easily change their tune on all of this. I mean, a lot of them, once again, although they were involved in the Abraham Accords, although they were kowtowing to Israel, they were just as eager to normalize relations with the Iranians under the framework of a Chinese agreement. So they're
Yeah.
very fickle countries. And I think probably the biggest elephant in the room that we're overlooking here is Turkey, who has completely changed their tone on Israel. Once again, a country that was very friendly with Israel for a number of years, even under Erdogan, uh, has now taken up the mantle of the Palestinian resistance. And I think Erdogan is probably the best bellwether you could have of something like this. Somebody who can sense the change in direction, who can pick up on these trends. Whereas before, even if it was tacit, he was on Israel's side. He's taken a much more hardline stance against them, which I don't think bodes well in terms of just global trends.
Yeah.
But with all that being said, I suppose there's only a couple other things I wanted to do, which we could go back and we could talk about the nuclear blackmail issue out of Russia, and also cover some domestic U.S. news because I know we touched a little bit on the
Hmm.
power plants, but we didn't talk about the alleged fire at Zaporozhye or the
Yeah. Yeah. We could. Yeah.
the tire fire. And I wanted to bring this up earlier, but like I said, we got too deep in the Middle East. No problem with that, but I just wanted to loop back around to that where while you do have the alleged Ukrainian advance towards the Kursk nuclear power plant, and what many speculate is they're trying to get within artillery range, within missile range from that, particularly the
Yeah.
HIMARS, in order to put that under threat, in order to have a threat of a nuclear disaster inside of Russia proper, if the Russians don't concede to X,
Yes.
Y, or Z demand. You do have that. It does seem like that's stalled, especially with some of the progress in Kursk, with some of the Russian reactions that the Ukrainians aren't quite in range to reach the Kursk power plant, but they are certainly much more in range to reach the Zaporozhye power plant, which has been a recurring issue. This was towards the beginning of the war when the Russians first captured it back in March 2022. You had the Ukrainians shelling it, which they claimed the Russians had shelled it despite the fact it was under Russian control for a number of days at that point. You had September 22 with the scare about the dirty bomb, and it looked like the Russians were actually advancing through Kherson towards Nikolaev, and then you had of course, the U.S. deployments to Romania, the alleged threat of a dirty bomb, and also the Ukrainian threats towards the Zaporozhye power plant uh, stalled that out. In fact, you could even attribute that to the Russians retreating to the other side of the Dnieper in Kherson because of that in November 2022, as I'm sure you all remember. 2023, there were a couple instances of threats towards the Zaporozhye power plant from the Ukrainians. And now, on top of this, it was on Sunday evening local time in Ukraine where there was video footage of just black plumes of smoke coming from the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. Now, it's been in cold shutdown since more or less the beginning of the war. At this point, they've kept the reactors down in order to prevent any sort of crisis at such an unstable time. And that they said there were fires there, that they managed to keep those fires under control, that nothing was particularly damaged. A lot of what has been hit just over the course of the past 2 years has actually been, just say, the administrative buildings at the power plant rather than the reactors themselves. But you had this video footage of the black plumes coming out, and almost immediately the Ukrainian line on it is the Russians are started a tire fire in order
Ah, ah,
to give the appearance that Ukraine is attacking the Zaporozhye power plant in order to
sure.
delegitimize us, because there's no pattern of behavior before that would establish that Ukraine would attack the Zaporozhye power plant. And of course, they'll spin this all: the Russians shelled their own power plant. It was the Russians who attacked it first, etc., and that they're the ones with the nuclear blackmail, that they're the ones who want to cause the disaster. And mind you, this is all with the alleged 90,000 troops from Russia that are amassing in Zaporozhye that are going to cross the river and march on Zaporozhye city, which I'll believe it when I see it. I know those are a little bit dated reports, but that's what the Ukrainians wanted us to believe for a number of days at least. But I do think that if this continues, especially if there are more losses in Kursk, and as attention draws away from Ukraine, especially in light of conflict in the Middle East increasing, if there is more activity out of Iran, if it does look like Iran and Israel are going to end up trading blows, I don't put it past the Ukrainians to begin their shelling operation again of the Zaporozhye power plant, because as we've seen, the IAEA, while they've never outright blamed Russia for it, they've never really come down to the issue of blaming Ukraine for it. They've tried to strike a very neutral line on it, and I guess you could say that's to their credit. That I know that several times they've said it's not our job to assign blame; it's our job to oversee the safety of these facilities. Which,
Yeah,
like I
right.
said, it's a very diplomatic answer, but we'll believe what we see. So they don't want to touch the issue because it's far too controversial, especially being an international agency. But as we've seen before, it seems like the Ukrainians face no consequences for shelling the plant, and that seems like, in terms of desperate moves they could take, in terms of a quite literal nuclear option they could take, that seems like the next move to do if they are really as desperate as we are to believe.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the IAEA is essentially I mean, it's a Western funded, you know, organization. They've never been completely honest, let's say, with reference to Syria. They've always obfuscated the truth. So it's not like, but whatever. I mean, it's to be expected. Everybody knows it's, everyone knows it was Ukraine, right? Like, why would the Russians want to set fire to a nuclear power plant that, like, most of it is turned off anyways? Like,
Especially when
what is Ukraine doing that, like, Russia would set off
there are
Russia,
still
like, literally lost hundreds of people trying to put out, Chernobyl. Like,
there are still three other power plants under Ukrainian control that, if they wanted to do this, they could just as easily target. If they were going,
yeah.
if we're to believe that the Russians wanted to blow up a nuclear power plant in Ukraine, why would they not blow one of the ones up in Western Ukraine? Why would they
Hmm.
not finish the job in Chernobyl? Uh,
Hmm.
Once again, there's so many different possibilities that, even if you are to assume the worst about the Russians, even if you are to assume that they would do something so unhinged, it doesn't make sense why they wouldn't once again try to crater one of the power plants in Western Ukraine, which uh, they most likely have no intention of even setting foot in at any point.
Yeah.
So turn everything west of Kiev into an irradiated lake, as far as they're concerned, for to believe what the Russians have to say. If we believe what they have to say about the Russians, I should say. But no, the narrative makes no sense. It's strange because they want to drum up this propaganda against Russia. They want to drum up that the Russians are a barbaric, unhinged power that's going to plunge the world into an irradiated hell that none of us can escape. But at the the same time, NATO is backing down. NATO is sheepish with its rhetoric about, say, letting Ukraine in post-war, or in terms of projection of power against Russia. A lot of that rhetoric has died off since the most recent NATO summit, which was an embarrassment in itself for NATO. The 75th anniversary summit did not go nearly as planned, in my opinion, at least from watching some of the reactions, some of the uh, machinations there. Of course, President Putin of Ukraine was kind enough to join Biden at the summit, but that feels like a lifetime ago. A day before Trump got shot, you had Biden calling Zelensky President Putin. Think about
Yeah.
that. Yeah, and like I said,
Crazy.
we'll get into some of the domestic U.S. news in just a minute here. Once we just tie up some of these loose ends on Ukraine, but really, it's the only move forward. And at this point, like I said, it wouldn't even drum up, in my opinion, that much Western backlash against the West. Of course, there would be rhetoric. There would probably be another sanctions package, but in terms of anything substantial against Russia, nothing more would come out of the West. But what it does seem like for the Ukrainians, they could create once again, a crisis that the Russians have to deal with. They would create a nuclear crisis where the Russians would be responsible for cleanup. They would be responsible for containment of the irradiation of the area, and it would also be a mass casualty event that they could capitalize on. And as we've seen, the Ukrainians do seem bent on the mass casualty events, as we've seen from their behavior in Donetsk over the past 10 years at this point, as we've seen in Belgorod more recently, Bryansk, Kursk. Um, Depending on how much you want to tie the Krokus attacks in Moscow at the beginning of the year back to them, you could even argue that. But once again, we've seen this since the beginning of the war. Ukraine taking these, resorting to these terror tactics, I suppose you can call them, where even if it serves no tactical or strategic advantage, they will do this in order to inflict pain on the Russian population and create crises for the Russian nation. And like I said, probably the biggest crises the Ukrainians are capable of creating is in a rated area in their annexed territories that they would have to contain this. That and Novgorod would be probably uninhabitable at that point. So you'd have to deal with. I mean, I don't know the population of Energodar off the top of my head, but I think it's one of the larger cities in that part of Ukraine. Not as large as Zaporozhye city, but once again, they would have to deal with uh, the population displaced from there, and who knows how wide of an area that would affect. You would have to deal with the illnesses that would result from that, because these people are Russian citizens now. They are the responsibility of the Russian state. So, if the Ukrainians really did want to throw everything away, if they did really think this was the last ditch effort, it actually does make a lot of sense that they would do something like this. And I know this has been speculated at many points throughout the war, but once again, it's more desperate in Ukraine than it's ever been.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's ultimately who's behind it. It's also a question of attention, right? Like the Ukrainians are desperate to have attention, So instead of Israel taking it all, and of course the election as well, right?
Yes, and especially moving on, they could very easily shift the election rhetoric in the United States about a nuclear crisis in Russia, about an irradiation crisis, about the second Chernobyl, as it were, as they would probably try to frame it in the media. And they could field those questions to the candidates, not only for president, but for other offices as well. And they could probably dominate the American media cycle for weeks with that. On and off, of course, they would oscillate back and forth between all the major stories, but they could make it a recurring story in the American media for the next year if they wanted to, if they blew up this place.
Hmm.
And like I said, I think even that is going a bit far. But once again, we're talking about even during the fire, the radiation levels, nothing off the charts was detected. There was no significant increase in radiation levels at the time of the attack, at the time of the so-called tire fires, the Ukrainians have told us. But once again, if they wanted to shift attention back to the Ukrainian war effort for months, like I said, they could create this crisis and I don't put it past them at this point. Well, whereas I may have said it's just a threat, it's just saber rattling. Even last year, uh, it's desperate enough at this point where, especially if Zelensky believes that his position, office is threatened, if he thinks that there's going to be some sort of internal politics against him, if there's going to be some sort of coup in Kiev against him, and that somebody's going to replace him, then it stands to reason he would do something like this. And uh, what more would shore up, say, the most radical factions of Ukrainian society than a move like this? I can't think of much else that would, beyond the fact that if this
Yeah.
Kursk expeditionary force were to actually capture territory and hold it.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's going to be very difficult for them to stay there, because I mean, they really have to get. I mean, it's not that the Ukrainians couldn't or wouldn't go into a defensive position. For the greater goal of maybe improving their bargaining chips at a future peace summit. Ultimately, it's really about diverting Russian troops from Donbass and Kharkov. That's the main reason for this. Because ultimately they cannot deal with the glide bombs.
No, no, they can't. And if they can divert Russian forces even long enough just to buy them some breathing room, maybe secure the next Western aid package, press gang some more men, then I suppose it'd all be worth it for the Ukrainians in the end.
Uh, yeah, and also the F-16s.
Oh
Uh,
yes,
they,
who could
they
forget
they
the
they haven't
F-16s?
yet started utilizing the F-16s. I think that's another thing that they're very anxious to begin doing.
Well,
Like
there is
they
actually
are
a little
going to
bit of.
pour everything into Kursk. I really believe that they're going to give everything they've got for this.
I agree. Now that you brought up the F-16s, the show was actually vindicated once again. I do have to point out because when Lindsey Graham visited Kiev, he was talking about courting Western pilots in order to join the Ukrainian Air Force and pilot these
Yes, I
F-16s.
saw that.
Which I don't think that there was really any other viable option in order for these F-16s to operate because of how few trained Ukrainian pilots there were. That they eventually would have to recruit foreign volunteers in order to operate these aircraft. In which case, they probably will recruit a few. It's it's a doomed mission. They might take some Russians down with them. The F-16, though, once again, is a formidable aircraft in its own right. But just given the level of Russian air superiority, given how much airspace, so to speak, the Ukrainians have lost, uh, a few dozen F-16s aren't going to turn the tide of this war. They're not going to be able to
Yeah.
establish, and once again, air superiority is out of the question. But they're not even going to be able to establish contested skies. It's just going to be a setback for Russia, and maybe that's all they need. Maybe it's just a few people who are willing to sacrifice themselves in order to tie down Russian air defenses and tie down Russian aircraft for, I don't know, a few weeks.
Mm.
But that's all I had out of that news, and I suppose since it is looming over us, and it is every episode, you want to talk some domestic U.S. politics?
Sure.
And because of your absence, I'll give the ground to you if you just have any general thoughts over just the events of the past month, anything that you wanted to get out there. Because, like I said, I know a lot has happened between the Trump assassination and Biden's resignation, Kamala seemingly coming out of nowhere, and we've all just accepted that she's the Democratic nominee, and that we're also going into the DNC next week as well.
Yeah, I mean she's very popular. Um, I mean I'm just stunned. I think I know it feels like almost a year ago, but the Trump assassination was just mind blowing. I could not believe it. Um, yeah, and I did follow some channels, and I'm firmly convinced that there was a second shooter, uh, based on the recordings from at least four different locations. That's not including the one that took out, the prime shooter. But there's nothing makes sense about this assassination attempt. Of course, I did not think that e Evil Blump got the best, the best ever marksman in America to graze his ear. You know, I remember that was going around because people were shocked how resolute and strong Trump looked, and I think that was the biggest takeaway. But you could also say that how much of a difference is it making? I think that's debatable. Um, I think there is room for a fortified election even this year. However, I don't see the strong backing. All right, in the same way that we saw Jill Biden like lose her mind to make sure that her her senile husband still remained president. Um, there is still a faction maybe that thinks that Harris could win or should win. On the other hand, you're not. There are no big endorsements this year. It's very different than 2020. I don't know what people thought of the interview with Musk. It was really long and rambling. Trump sounded like he had a lisp. Now, I know there's a lot of our listeners really like Trump. I mean, I like him. Like on a personal level, I like him. He's hilarious. Do I think he's good overall? No. Do I think he's going to turn things around or no, I don't. But like whatever. I mean, what choices do you have?
Yeah, like I've completely soured on electoral politics, but I don't begrudge anyone for supporting Trump, and I wouldn't encourage you not to support him. It's like
Yeah.
what I would say to you is just temper your expectations. We saw what happened the first time, and we're probably not going to get much change this time. Like I said, if you want to hold on to some sort of optimism, I won't begrudge you that. If you think that it,
Yeah, I
uh,
don't have it.
yeah, if you think that it shifts things slightly in our direction, fair enough. But I have to say I'm not sold on that, and I know sure you certainly are not.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, it's whatever. Um, on the whole Fuentes debate thing, like honestly, like 2020 was really the year that like how can I put it? My opinion is kind of more nuanced on what happened in 2020. I'm willing to believe that a lot of white male voters, particularly like in states like Pennsylvania, that had voted twice for Obama, voted for Trump in 2016. These people are not ideologues. They literally just wanted to vote for someone that they thought was going to improve their lives. And so for this reason, I think in 2020 that didn't show up. Now, I mean, Trump also got more votes in 2020 than he got in 2016. You have to think about that too. But let's say you stick with the hypothesis that uh, Trump lost some white votes. Let's say you stick with that, right? Trump lost white votes because after his first 4 years, whatever, he wasn't active enough, or he didn't try hard enough, or the deep state was too strong, or some mix of both. It just didn't happen, and people felt let down, and they didn't go out and vote, and the amount of like black and Hispanic voters for Trump increased. Now, I've seen some maps out there, and it for me, even if I suppose in some key states, if Trump got, more votes from these groups, he could win. Or, but I think that the real difference, just to return back to Fuentes, is 2020, it would have been great if he won. I don't know what he would have achieved, but I really hate this fortified elections, the gaslighting that they did, the whole article in Time magazine about how they did it. Facebook donated some. What did he donate? Something like $300 million. Like,
Something
people made
ridiculous like that.
it was ridiculous amounts of money. Of course, he's not doing that for Kamala Harris. So that kind of tells you, like, they probably want her to lose. Nobody wants to touch her. Nobody wants to be her running mate. Not really.
Look, I mean, they found the
She's tainted.
yeah, they found the least appealing white Midwestern governor they could because I mean, look, there were other decent options. They could have a lot of generic white guys they could have put on the bottom of the ticket. They found the worst one, Tim Walz, this guy who can't speak without putting his foot in his mouth. And like I said, not even that like I feel that strongly about this election, but just objectively speaking, this just is not a good ticket. And I think you might be alluding to what I've been saying for the past few weeks here, and I would be curious to see if we're on the same page
Mm,
here. And
mm.
I think we are just based on some of our talks off the show. That they've made peace with the Trump win, and in many ways they're preparing for him to be the fall guy for a lot of the things that are going to go wrong in the next 4 years.
Yeah, I think so. Like I say, maybe there's a faction that still thinks she can win, and they'll try something, but like, the big backers aren't there. I don't know. Maybe they think it's just the media alone can do it this time. You have to be careful with these people. But yeah, I'm kind of with you. Like, they feel settled that he's going to win, and who knows? Maybe he's the guy who's going to get them the Iran war. Um, they've, like, I mean, that stupid story that the Iranians were behind his assassination attempt. Like, that was just, and in many ways, I can just, that foreshadows, like, what exactly that they may be up to. I mean, obviously, it was the Biden admin that wanted him dead. The bullseye comment about you know that happened a night before, 2 nights before the assassination attempt. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think that's controversial to say that there were internal machinations in the state that wanted that. And then they would put up, I don't know, whatever generic Republican on the ticket, and it would have been that, have them run against Kamala and just have, two dead fish run for office, where they didn't get that. And they create somewhat of a sympathy boost for Trump. How much that will carry into November, we'll see about that. But just objectively speaking, putting aside any personal opinions, who are you leaning towards for actual prediction about winning? I know it's early. I know we're like 3 months out, but uh, who would you say has the advantage? Just looking at it right here, just like I said, facts on the ground versus personal, setting aside personal opinion.
Who do I believe will win the 2024 election?
Yeah, just as of now, like I said, I know it's a little bit early, but just what's your
Mm.
feel for it right now? Who do you think
My,
has the
my my
advantage?
feel for it is that Trump will win it. Based on what I've said.
Yes, I would tend to agree that I don't think Kamala is the one that they want to win, and that fundamentally she's just too tainted by the Biden administration, and that um, her ability to run a campaign is just non-existent. And we'll see what happens at the DNC next week if there's any sort of disruption or disorder there. But going back to the argument some made when Biden first had dropped out or was couped, as some might believe, I believe it was a coup, that the dispute between Clinton and Obama within DNC party politics about putting Kamala up versus not putting her up. Like I said, I think this is somebody that they have set up to take the ball of this election, let Trump in. Eventually, Ukraine will go to hell under him. Just judging by the momentum of the war.
Hmm.
We might be in for another economic crisis if some of the activity we saw in the stock market about a week and a half
Yeah.
ago does continue. And if the situation in the Middle East escalates, especially if he is at the helm of another military operation, not even a war, not even like boots on the ground against Iran, but if there's some sort of major escalation in the Middle East that the United States participates in, that's on his shoulders. In which case, once again, they can point the fingers at Trump, say, "You just had to listen to us. We should have never let the evil orange man into office." And then they can come in 2028 with whatever polished candidate they have, and well, let's just you know look at it our options here in terms of the Democrats. It's probably just going to be a generic white dude because I think that maybe 40 years down the road, depending on how the demographic and social state of the country changes, it might be somebody different. But let's just say Gavin Newsom as a placeholder, not necessarily him, but just him as a placeholder. Just somebody who can walk the moderate line, somebody who has some degree of charisma, can come in and say, we're gonna have a fresh start. We're gonna leave Trumpism behind, and he can, I guess, if maybe it's a bad comparison considering what happened in the UK over the past couple
Hmm.
weeks here, but he can do what Keir Starmer did and be like, oh, fresh reset, and we're gonna get back to sensible center left policies. Uh, and of course, as we know, crises would continue under somebody like that. But I
Oh
do
yeah, there's not going to be any sensible
no,
anything.
no.
It's just
That's the line that they're going to sell. That's the narrative that they're going to put forward. But I do think that uh, that is the game plan for the Democrats for the next 4 years. And I might be attributing way too much credit to them in that regard. But I do think that many in the party have just conceded that we're going to have to deal with 4 more years in opposition, and we can make things bad for Trump, and we can. It might be a blessing in disguise because a lot of stuff can be blamed on him at that point. In which case, we can come in and have something of a party reset and come forward with Obama 2.0, or like I said, um, you whatever focus group candidate they manage to dig up in the next 4 years.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, a Democrat. I mean, the impression I get, Democrats are thinking about 2028, not about 2024. Trump is only going to be in for 4 years anyways. They know how to interfere. They know how to blame him. Like it won't make that much of a difference. He might be egotistical enough to just want to be president in order to go after Iran. He certainly talks a lot about Israel. Oh my God, Israel! Oh, the poor Jews and Jews in America are so stupid. How could they not like on and on and on,
I will
like
always love that clip of him.
one APAC talking point after another.
I'll always love the clip of him at the golf cart shouting at them, "I gave you the goal on Heights."
No, my God, yeah. Oh, it's so good. It's so good. See, that's the thing. It's impossible to hate him for a long time. He's a buffoon, but he's lovable. Like
Yeah, like you can have a sober analysis about
yeah,
everything you just said, but then he just
I
comes in.
know.
Yeah, he just comes in with those moments, and like I said, you don't even have to. You can be honest about him. You can be honest about the real effects of it, but you can also appreciate the
Yes.
moments that he would deliver. And like I said, that's probably the strongest argument for it. And then I would say the second strongest is denying, let's just say, pigmented Hillary a term in office, because the outrage around that would be funny, I guess.
Hmm.
Those are the two arguments you could make, I suppose. But yeah, like I said, I generally agree with you in that the Democrats are looking towards 2028, and that they've written off 2024 unless there's some true believer, some hardliner who wants to play the fortification game again, 2 elections in a row, which I don't think is impossible. But like I said, I do think that with that they're setting him up for this, and he they can make his second term a repeat of his first term. Uh,
Yeah.
in which case, that probably, I mean, and you also look at some of the projections. You look at the betting odds, even though they do have Harris up right now. I think that it once again, you can't trust the polls. The betting odds are better, but you can't put your full faith in them. But once again, it does look like the Democrats are poised to take back the House. The Senate does look slightly in favor of the Republicans, but point being is there'll be a gridlocked government, and there'll be enough where they can stonewall him like they did his first term, and
Yeah.
the most he can do are some executive orders. In which case, like I said, and I have no doubt. I mean, we're also about a month out from his sentencing because they did delay his sentencing from July. So who knows what legal consequences he'll face just in the last month and a half of the election. And also, who knows once he comes in office? Is there going to be another Russiagate type scandal where it's just constant investigation, just keeping him embattled? That's also a
Hmm.
very real
Hmm.
possibility. Now, they probably won't do the same line over and over again. They probably won't say Russia hacked the election or whatever. But point being is that they'll have some sort of equivalent scandal that they can bring in some sort of special counsel to waste the first 2 years of his term, like they did the first time.
Hmm.
So, like I said, just to reiterate, um, I don't begrudge anyone for supporting Trump, but the one thing I would say, as I said earlier, is temper your expectations greatly, because you can expect a lot of what we saw the first time. That's not a reason to write him off if you still have some faith in electoral politics, but our position on the war report, that ship has sailed for quite some time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Absolutely. Well,
And
whatever. I mean, I don't know. Maybe
and
if they were really young in 2016, they don't see it. Whatever. I don't know what to say. I
And
mean,
speaking of electoral politics, I suppose the last thing I forgot to mention that's completely unrelated to all of this is that Vucic is under fire. There's the
yes,
protests in
yes. I'm
Serbia, which
glad. I'm glad
yes,
you brought that up. Huge protests, apparently, right? And these protests were ostensibly anti-EU. Um, and it came down to a big lithium deposit that has been discovered in Serbia, and Germany is the one who wants to mine it. So there's a huge deal. I mean, essentially what this comes down to is Vucic just finding a way to remain in office, or you could even argue for them not to subvert Serbia in some way. So this is like you could argue is a slower method. Um, but it was at least good to see that most Serbs were against this. You know, um, yeah. Now the protest didn't do anything. Vucic, like I don't know, I'm sorry to say, I mean he's such a bitch. Oh, they're going to
a spiritual manlet.
yeah, they're going to coup me. And of course, Russia oh, we warned you, stay safe. Like, I don't know, they didn't play this right. Like, I feel like, I mean, who knows what they would have done if they allowed the protest to be successful? You always have to think about that. Serbia is extremely isolated. I don't know if people, yes, Hungary is a friendly nation, but it has no friendly nation next to it.
No, in
E- Every
Hungary,
other nation, every other nation that shares a border with it, except for Serbia, sorry, Hungary, is just a NATO cuck nation. Like they all belong to America.
and Hungary is embattled in its own right. I'm not saying that they've thrown Serbia under the bus. I'm not saying that
Yeah,
Orban
they
is
don't
a
have the
sellout, but the Hungarians don't have much to work with. They have their own battles to fight
yes,
right now.
exactly, exactly.
Especially if this Druzhba crisis continues, if there actually is an energy crisis in Hungary, uh, I'm not saying this would be the end of Orban, but this could put him in a far more embattled position than he has been in a number of years.
Yeah.
As energy prices increase, because once again, he has managed to get the exemptions from the sanctions. He's managed to work his way around, use whatever political influence he does have within the European Union, in order to
Hmm.
keep Hungary relatively stable while the rest of Europe is experiencing economic crisis. And it looks like that might be coming for Hungary as well. So they don't necessarily have the resources or the leverage to spare in order to bail out Serbia. And then, on the other hand, surrounded by NATO countries, the only non-NATO country that doesn't border them is Bosnia, and Bosnia is a mess in its own right. And I know that there's the uh, Republika Srpska there that is always. I know Dodik always threatens to secede, but we never see it happen. But Bosnia is effectively a NATO military base. Nothing's going to happen there. And like you said, they're surrounded. There's not much they can do. Even in terms of say air access the Russians are cut off. I suppose they have a lifeline in China because the European Union can't quite afford to cut off China yet, and that you even have some of the hardliners against China who, like Maloney, who I could I could complain about all day, but I'll spare you the ramblings and the rants right now. Who goes to China and tries to reconcile uh, and apologizes for leaving the Belt and Road and trying to become reintegrated in that just because they lost economic opportunity. But you have the Chinese there, but ultimately there's not many options for Serbia, and they have to play this how it is. And some might say it's only a matter of time before they actually get their color revolution. In which case, I don't want to have that pessimistic look on the situation.
Hmm.
But once again, they are embattled, and it's going to take a great deal of effort in order to avoid that. And frankly, judging on my let's just say at least peripheral observation of Serbian politics, certainly haven't given as much attention as other parts of Europe or Russia, the United States, China, etc., the other big players. But from my peripheral observation of it, I would say since the start of this show for the past 6 years, Vucic is not the man with the backbone to uh, stand up against the system. He's not the David to fight this Goliath, so to speak.
I like that. That's very well put.
But is there such a man in Serbia? We can only hope to God there is. But
Yes,
uh,
I hope
as
so.
I mean, they're resilient people. You gotta give them that. I mean, even after everything, I mean, they still haven't capitulated. They still haven't joined NATO. They still haven't fallen into a color revolution. You can give them all of that. Just down to the people. Uh, and is there a way out? Possibly, but it's a narrow window and it's rapidly closing. And who knows when it will actually be closed? But uh, I would say it's a do or figurative die. I don't think Serbia is going to be subsumed by mass migration the way a lot of Western countries are. Maybe mass emigration the way a lot of its Eastern European neighbors are. But I do think in many ways, not necessarily in the most existential way, but in many ways, it is a do or die moment for Serbia.
I mean, given everything that Serbia has gone through, the isolation, um, Serbia's economy is not bad with respect to the countries next to it. You know, um, I mean, it's doing better than a lot of other countries. Yeah, certainly better than Macedonia or Albania or Montenegro, Romania, Bulgaria. Like it still punches, well above their weight.
Oh, absolutely.
In hindsight, right? Like, I mean, Croatia, okay, it's part of the EU. It gets loans. It's there to
Coastal,
it,
seaports.
coastal seaport. Is there basically as an antagonistic country against Serbia. That's its function, its role. Yeah.
But yeah, we'll see what. I mean, if there's a nation that can endure this kind of onslaught, I would say it's Serbia. But we'll ultimately have to see what that looks like in the end, and that it's. You're right that its economy is doing remarkably well, all things considered, and that they haven't found a reason to put it under any sort of sanctions regime, fortunately. But the next few years, I think, especially with the so-called Serbs Against Violence protests that we saw at the beginning of the year, and with some of the political machinations that we've seen just in the past couple of weeks, it's going to be a time of embattlement for the country. If not literal war, then it's going to be a massive pressure campaign against this country to bend the knee.
Yeah, I mean, he may have staved off, the so-called protests against violence. It's literally the dumbest name I've ever heard for a protest movement. Primarily because they engage in violence. But in any case, he could be staving off them if, let's say, this is something that the West has wanted. Because you know who's going to activate them, right? Um, a lot of these lithium deposits, they're in Ukraine, and there's a big one on the west side of the Dnieper, and there's a big one on the east side of the Dnieper, and that's where we are right now. I could I don't know if I have the map with me, but I do have a map somewhere in my files about the lithium deposits in either of those locations in Ukraine.
Yeah, I knew that there were lithium deposits found. I didn't know that they were doled out to Germany already. I don't know. Was there any sort of Chinese bid on them? I figured that would have been the case.
Yeah, yeah. The Chinese were interested in that as well. Um, I can't find the map, but I do have maps of Ukraine with like oil deposits, gas deposits, lithium. Yeah, unfortunately, I can't find the one with lithium, but I did see it not long ago. But it's on either side of the Dnieper. One of them is like south of Kiev, about on par where Dnipropetrovsk is, but west of there, and the other one is closer to like it's halfway between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk, or as the Ukrainians just call it, Dnieper.
And just to press the point, if we're to believe that electric vehicles are the future, which I think, even practically speaking, is just simply not the case, judging on the performance we've seen with some of these things, lithium is going to be vital. And
Yeah,
I mean, it's already vital for just batteries in general, but especially for the EV batteries, it's a non-negotiable.
yeah.
And like I said, we'll see what actually develops with that. But it just opens up a whole new world of possibilities for chaos, unfortunately, in that this could be another front for both indirect and direct warfare against these countries. And I don't think the situation is going to get better in that regard, especially if the behemoth in Brussels does continue down its current path, and that there's really no other direction it can go in. And like I said, barring some black swan event that completely reorients Europe politically, it's going to be a tough few years for everyone on the continent, east, west, in different ways. Don't get me wrong, in very different ways, but it's going to be a tough few years, and this only opens more possibilities for strife and conflict. Unfortunately, what should be something that is, and I know some more environmentally minded people, which I try to be to a degree, but some of the more environmentally minded people than I am might take issue with this on principle. But what should be something that is very constructive, the finding of a new natural resource, is going to be, on the contrary, very destructive. And who knows? I might sound like a little
Hmm.
bit of a bleeding heart saying that, but once again, I'm no pacifist. I'm no idealist in that regard, but I hate to see potential for cooperation squandered when it's there.
Yeah.
But that's all I had on that. If you have any last minute stories you want to bring into this,
No, that's about it for me.
well, thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. It's great to have GSP back. It's things. It's like you never left with with the way the stories have developed. How many of the topics that we have to cover over and over because so many things happen with those. But no, it is great to have you back. I'm sure the audience
Thank you.
appreciates having a little bit more of a dialogue on the show than the monologue. Which I mean, look, I'll thank the audience for putting up with my monologuing for 5 weeks or however long it was. I'm glad you all stuck with that, but I'm sure the show benefits greatly from the conversation aspect with that.
Yeah,
And
it's hard for anybody to do it on their
yeah,
own.
and look forward to more episodes as the news develops. And look, if something happens, we might not be there right away, but we'll be there. But what I can guarantee you is we'll be there before it happens, and then it'll happen the day the episode airs. As happens more times than I can count. Not only just in the recent developments in the world, but just in the past 6 years of the show. And just one final reflection I'll say is being a type of program like this that began well before the 2022 Ukraine war uh, does put us in a very interesting position where, like I said, we've been talking about this for 6 years, and all credit where credit is due to people who started talking about this when, say, Ukraine or the stuff in Israel and Palestine broke out. A lot of people like that have great coverage, but in my opinion, having talked about this for 6 years, I do think it gives us a greater scope. We can call back, we can reference these things. Like I said, they've been at the forefront of our mind for the better part of a decade at this point, and I'm glad that hey, many of you have been there since the beginning. A lot of you have come more recently, in which case, like I said, I'm glad you're enjoying the program. But I would actually, just as a final note, despite the quality issues, despite some of the technical quality issues, if you do have the time, go through the archive. I think it might give you some greater perspective on the issues that we talk about, because once again, while they weren't as intense, while some new issues have developed since, I do think it will give you a greater perspective of everything we talk about to this day.
Mm, yeah, yeah.
Um, but thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thank you and take care, guys.